I'll never leave the WWF. All right. And scene. Welcome back. So tonight we are in Exodus, and last week covering Genesis. A lot of information that's going to be the same, but we're not going to recover much of it. It's going to be whole new information tonight, but if you were here last week or you still have the packet from Genesis, a lot of that's still pertinent. It's still very much important when talking about Exodus for reasons that you probably can gather. But starting with Exodus, what is Exodus? Exodus is the second book of the Bible, second book of Moses, second book of the Pentateuch. We talked about the Pentateuch last week, first 5 books of the Bible, called the books of Moses, sometimes called the Law. The Hebrew people call it the Torah, the word Torah literally just meaning instructions. And so Exodus is the second book of instructions. The name Exodus is not found anywhere in the book of Exodus the way that Moses wrote it. Okay, the name Exodus comes from the Greek translation. Bear in mind, Moses did not speak or write in Greek. Moses spoke and wrote in Hebrew, as well as probably some sort of an Egyptian, Mesopotamian type language. But the name Exodus does come from the Greek translation. If you ever hear me say the LXX, I think I've said that once or twice while preaching. LXX is a version of the Bible. It's the Greek Septuagint, sometimes just called the LXX. It's because of the way that it was translated. There were 70 guys that took part in translating it. You probably never need to know that in your life. But if you ever hear me talk about the Septuagint or the LXX, it was one of the first Greek Old Testaments. And in that one, Exodus 19, 1, has this word exodu. This will show you how difficult it is to translate out of Greek into English. It doesn't translate right over. So you have though, while, month the third, the Exodus, the son, Israel, from earth out of land, Egypt. That's how that it would read literally. You kind of have to piecemeal it together to get, in the third month of the Exodus, the children of Israel came out from the land of Egypt. That's the way that you would render it into the English. And so that word Egypt, Exodus, in the Greek exodu, literally just means a way out. Okay? So in the third month of their finding a way out, the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. All right? The Hebrew people never called it the Exodus. If you would have asked Moses or Joshua for that matter, what was the Exodus like? They would have said, the what? Because they didn't have any concept of that word. They called the book this name, and these are the names of. So they would say, in the book of, and these are the names of. That's how that they referred to it. Those are the first words of the book. So the Hebrew people, very straightforward. Not a lot of gravitas, the way that they did it. Ours is a little more magnanimous. But those first words, and these are the names of, actually shows you that the book of Exodus was never intended to be read by itself. It's not a solo book. Okay, it's meant to be read in conjunction with Genesis. That it flows directly into Exodus. There's not an introductory phrase. It's a transitional statement right out of Genesis into Exodus. So when you read Exodus, you need to understand, I'm not reading something that this was a book written by itself. This is the continuation of a story. Right? And the same thing with the book of Acts. When you read the book of Acts, you can read it on its own, but it's not meant to be read that way. You're supposed to read the Gospels and then Acts, right? It's a continuation of a story. So Exodus is the same way. In fact, Exodus 1:1 opens with the exact same words that are used in Genesis 46:8. The exact same words. So Moses intends for you to see this is one continual story. This is just one storyline going directly into the next. This isn't in the notes. Exodus is written in 11 small chunks. It doesn't actually divide the storyline up. You can see where the story was broken, and there's not an obvious reason why, because it continues going, but you can see it stop. The reason why Exodus stops 11 different times is because that was the end of a scroll. They would write a whole scroll, run out of paper, and then roll it up and start another one. And so he would stop if he had this much left and the story was at a good stopping place. He would just stop and roll it up and start a new one. And so as you're reading Exodus, sometimes you'll come to these points where it just stops and you have a new narrative just erupt in. That's how Moses did that. He would run out of scroll room and start a new one. Uh, yeah, the Exodus plays a crucial part in the Torah. The Torah being instructions, the Exodus is very important as an instruction book. It instructs you about a lot of the laws that are going to be followed through the rest of the Old Testament. The Ten Commandments, Exodus 20. So you begin to get the concept of laws in the book of Exodus. You don't really have laws in Genesis. You see Jesus, you see God talking with people like Cain, talking with people like Adam, talking with Abraham, but he doesn't necessarily give laws, thou shalt not. Exodus, you start getting laws like that. It's much more formal. You start getting real instructions. It introduces this central example of how God's going to deal with his people, a series of instructions as well as a series of directions on how to build the tabernacle and how to worship him. That becomes very important in Exodus. By whom and when was Exodus written? Okay. We talked about this at length last week, talking about that Genesis was written by Moses. Same thing, we just talked about you can't really read Exodus without connecting it to Genesis. So the idea that Exodus was written by Moses, you actually have more reason to believe Exodus was written by Moses than Genesis. And we believe Genesis was. So why would we say that Moses was definitely the author of Exodus? Well, because it says so on several occasions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But logically speaking, the book of Exodus speaks of Moses in a very lowly way. Moses is depicted as a guy who is very flawed, even makes a big point to talk about how that he was reluctant to do what God was telling him to do. It doesn't shy away from some of his lower moments, such as when he kills a person for abusing a slave. It doesn't shy away from showing Moses in a negative light. Anybody who knew Moses or who knew how this story was going to end would not have written those things about him. That if you were writing the story of the Exodus and you knew that Moses was going to become the leader of the children of Israel and the one who goes up on the mountain and talks with God face to face and receives the law directly from his hand, you're not going to depict Moses as this lowly person that's heavily flawed. Moses, on the other hand, would have written it that way. If he was writing his own story, he would want you to know this occurred to me even though I'm like this, or even though I was like this beforehand. So the only person who would depict Moses like that would be Moses. He's more likely to write himself that way than anybody else. And so if we believe that Moses wrote Exodus, we can believe that it was written during his lifetime, which we say was between 1491, around here-ish, and 1405, around here-ish. Remembering this is in the BC era, before Christ, the years go down. Okay, so 1500 is technically before 1400 on the timeline. That's one of these weird things we kind of wrap our mind around. The 1400s happened after the 1500s in the BCs. Okay, so Moses lives somewhere between 1491 and 1405 BC. That introduces a more important question, though, historically. When did the Exodus occur? The coming out of the children of Israel from Egypt. When did that happen? And did it historically happen? This was a big question for me when I was really coming into the faith. I wanted to know if the Exodus literally historically occurred. And if you read historical literature, there's a lot of people who, from a historical viewpoint, will just flatly tell you there's no evidence that the Exodus occurred. That's true and false. So they came out of Egypt, they walk in the desert for 40 years, and they go into Canaan. The period of them walking through the desert, we don't have archaeological evidence of that. Why? Because they were moving through the desert. Okay, you don't build cities, right? You don't plant your ground and build architecture when you're wandering in the desert. So there's no archaeology to prove that era. But what about all the rest of it? The going into Canaan and the coming out of Egypt. Do we have evidence of that? Up until the late 1800s, the answer was always yes. The Exodus occurred literally in history with real people, and it occurred somewhere in Moses' lifetime between 1491 and 1405. But then we get into the 1900s with what we call higher criticism, and liberal theologians coming out of Germany predominantly began to say that most of the Bible didn't actually happen. And so they began speculating. They said Moses never actually existed. The Exodus never historically occurred. And they came up with this idea of where did the story come from. They called it the conquest model. We'll come back to this in a moment. The conquest model said there was no Exodus whatsoever. The story was made up to validate their conquest. And so, story is, some group of people called Hebrews invaded the Canaan land and wanted to justify their invading it. And so they created this story where they had been slaves, they had been the oppressed, and God himself told them to go in there and take the land, and God himself gave them the land. Okay, that was the idea. The Exodus never occurred. Moses was never real. They just made the story up to justify coming in and conquering the land. All right, that's the conquest theory. And what that did was it said the dates don't matter because it didn't happen. Moses wasn't real. The Exodus didn't happen. The dates don't matter because it never actually occurred. It's like trying to figure out when Mary had a little lamb. It's not a real person, so you can't figure out when it happened, right? It doesn't matter. But it was soon discovered that there was evidence of Israelites, Hebrews, living in Canaan in 1150 BC. So that'd be around here-ish. Okay, they knew the Israelites were in Israel, Canaan, by then. Okay, well that doesn't really change much because we still don't think that the Exodus ever happened. But then they started thinking, well, if we've got this ancient group of people, when did they come into the land? Why and how? And so they start looking for evidence of Israelites or Jews in Egypt's history. And that brings you to what's called the Merneptah stele. Last week we talked about the Hammurabi stele, okay, which was one of the first instances of law being written down. That was in the 1700s BC. This is the Merneptah stele. It was carved in 1207 BC. It was an Egyptian artifact, wrote down Egyptian history. That's all that it was. They just wrote down their history. Took us a while to translate it. They found it in 1898. Took us several years to translate the thing. But when we translated it, we found that they were already talking about that there was this group of people in Canaan called Hebrews that they hated because they were a thorn in their side. The Egyptians had a rivalry at that time with the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were in the north, the Egyptians were in the south, and they wanted a war, but there was this nation in the middle that was a problem for them called Israel. And the Hebrew people were a thorn in their side. It actually proved to be useful later on because they didn't have to go to war because there was Israel in between them to keep this buffer type thing, kind of like Belgium between Germany and France. But for the time being, in the 1200s, they were already saying, we wish these Israelites were not in Canaan. Okay, so that means that we had Hebrew people in Israel at least by the 1200s. Okay, so that pushes us back. We were in 1150, now we're in the 1200s. And so they start reevaluating, okay, so how early were the Israelites in Canaan and how did they get there? Then they start looking into further ancient Egyptian resources, and they find that in really ancient Egyptian literature, the Egyptians spoke about a group of people that they called the Habiru people, Habiru, Habiru. And they put two and two together, and they go, oh, this is the Hebrews. This is the Hebrew people. They just called them the Habiru people. And so that pushed us back. We were at 1150, then we were in the 1200s, then that brought us into the 1300s. They're going, man, we're getting really far back here that the Egyptians are talking about these Hebrews. Now, reminder, when does the Bible say that the Exodus occurred? The Bible says the Exodus occurred in the middle of the 1400s. And they just keep getting further and further and further back, getting closer to what the Bible has said the whole time. The date that's well been accepted for at least 400 or 500 years by Christians for the Exodus was anywhere between 1491 and 1405, but we actually have a lot more specific of a date than that. In 1 Kings chapter 6, it says that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign, and that's on this chart here. You have Solomon building the temple in the 4th year of his reign. That was either in 967 or 966 BC. We know for certain. He started to reign either in 970 or 71. So 4 years later, he starts building the temple. That's 967 or 966, somewhere in there. That passage, 1 Kings chapter 6, it says, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, he started building the temple. And that was 480 years after the Exodus. It's exactly what it says. He started building it in the 4th year of his reign, 480 years after the Exodus. So we do basic math, 966 or 967. You go 480 years in the past, you get the year 1446. Okay, so according to the Bible, the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC. There's other evidence in the book of Judges. Judges 11:26, one of the judges named Jephthah. He's in a negotiation with the Ammonites, and the Ammonites are saying, you're on our land, we were here before you. And Jephthah says, you're exactly right, you've got us. You were here before we were. We've been living on Ammonite land, but we've been living here for over 300 years. Okay, so that's a time marker. We've been here for 300 years or a little more. When was Jephthah having that conversation? History tells us that the Ammonite oppression took place in 1106 BC. So you go to 1106, you go back 300 years, and you get 1406. How long were the Israelites in the desert? 40 years. So 40 years before 1406 brings you to 1446. So the Bible's crystal clear. The Exodus occurred exactly that year, 1446 BC. That's when the Bible says the Exodus occurred. Now, historians, secular historians, they're still stuck in the 1300s here. They're saying, well, we have evidence that the Hebrew people were in Canaan in this era, the 1300s. So we need to renegotiate on our theory. Right then, their theory had been this conquest idea. The Exodus never happened, but they invaded and, well, they explained it. They changed their theory. They flipped entirely, and they said, well, there might have been a limited Exodus and no conquest at all. Okay, maybe a small group of Hebrew people had been slaves in Egypt, and that small group came out of Egypt in the Exodus, and they came into Canaan, and they aligned themselves with this group of other non-indigenous people, and they took over the land. There was no conquest. They created the story to say they had a divine right to the land. That was the new theory. Okay? The problem with that is they denied that there was a conquest. There was no coming in and waging war. Archaeology, again, did them in on that one. In the Bible, the Exodus narrative and getting into the book of Joshua tells us that there were 3 cities that were entirely destroyed by the Israelites when they came in and invaded. It was the city of Jericho, the city of Ai, and the city of Hazor. You remember the story of Jericho. That one's really, really popular. And the walls came a-tumbling down, VeggieTales, right? So the story of Jericho you remember. The city of Ai you might remember. And then Hazor you probably don't. But the stories are very clear that those are the 3 cities that were destroyed. Moses was pretty emphatic when you come into a city, don't destroy it. Try to negotiate with them, try to get them to leave peaceably, and if they won't leave, then just kick them out. If they still won't leave, then you kill them. But try your very best not to do too much damage. We want to preserve what God's giving us. We'll destroy their idols and their Asheroth and their high places, but we won't destroy their cities unless they wage war. 3 of those cities chose war. We've found those cities now, okay? The city of Hazor was excavated in about the year 2000, very recently. They're still doing the excavations there. What they've already found, we got this quote here in your notes, obvious traits of dramatic destruction, such as a thick layer of ash and charred wood as deep as 3 feet in places. Okay, so the city was clearly destroyed, burned to the ground. The primary excavation director, Mr. Amnon Ben-Tur, strongly affirms that the city was destroyed by the Israelites, and the previous excavation director, Yigael Yain, presented evidence that the city was destroyed at the end of the 15th century BC, which would be around the year 1400 BC. Again, if the Exodus occurs in 1446 and they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, he's saying that the city was burned down around the year 1400. We're right there. It's exactly when the Bible says that happened. So he confirmed that. In 2008, there were excavations done in the city of Ai. They revealed a burn layer and an abundance of broken pottery, showing a sudden and calamitous event occurring in the city that ended its habitation. Perhaps most incredibly, though, the city of Jericho. We found that one a long time ago. In the early 1900s, a guy named John Garstung of the University of Liverpool, he was doing an excavation there. This is his report. I got this quoted from the newspaper where he wrote it. He said he had discovered in the royal tombs of Jericho evidence that Moses was rescued precisely in 1527 BC by the then princess, later the great queen Hatshepsut, that he was brought up by her as a court favorite, that he fled from Egypt after the accession of her enemy Thutmose III. The material found in these tombs also confirms the story of the fall of Jericho, which dates to about 1400 BC, and the Exodus to 1447 BC. That was over 100 years ago. This archaeologist says, I found all of that evidence in the city. Okay, he confirmed everything that the Bible said. Other archaeologists went in, and they were in agreement with everything that he found, but they went further and they began excavating the walls. They found that the walls had fallen, just as the Bible said. They have collapsed, with the city evidently having been burned. Okay, so they're confirming just right and left everything the Bible says that happened in the era in which the Bible says it occurred. All present archaeologists agree the city was uninhabited for at least a century following 1400 BC. Okay, so at least 100 years after that weird date, the city is suddenly uninhabited. They don't have any other theories as to what happened. Okay, there's no other ideas as to what occurred to make the walls fall down, the city gets burned, and there's suddenly all these records about Moses and the people of Israel. There's no other theories. So not only has the biblical timeline been shown to be plausible, the biblical timeline has actually been shown to be definitively correct. This is what we've always said happened. It's what the Bible says happened. It's when it says it happened. And archaeology and historians continually find, actually, yeah, that's pretty much right. That's true. Now, when I was at EKU, this is an absolutely insane. Every time I talk about this, I think how ridiculous this statement is. When I was at EKU, I studied under one of the world's leading Egyptologists, which is just a ridiculous thing. I don't know what one of the world's leading Egyptologists is doing at Eastern Kentucky University, but she was. Her name was Jacqueline J., Dr. J., and she is one of the world's leading Egyptologists. And I took a class with her, World History 1, which she focused primarily on Egypt. And she was talking about this group of people called the Hyksos, which is this mysterious group of people in Egyptian history that lived in Egypt in the 1500s BC. They were a different ethnicity than the Egyptians. Nobody knows where they came from. And at some point, the Hyksos just got up and left. And nobody knows where they went. They have no idea what happened to them or where they came from. The only other references to them, other than these records of Hyksos being there in the 1500s, which you'll see this blue portion, that's during the time when the Bible says the Israelites were enslaved. The only other record of the Hyksos is when they're referred to as the Sea People. That's what they're called in other areas of Egyptian literature, the Sea People. Which I think is hilarious, because that would imply that if it is the Hebrew people, that the Egyptians, the last thing they heard about them was they marched into the Red Sea, went to the other side, then the sea swallowed their leaders, and so they just from that point forward called them the Sea People. Historians don't take that position. They think their theory is that the Hyksos were called the Sea People because they walked out of Egypt, got on boats, sailed into the Mediterranean Sea, and were never heard from again. Somehow they died in storms in the Mediterranean. I don't think that's right, but I actually think that the Hyksos and the Sea People are the Hebrews. That's my theory, my crazy conspiracy theorist idea. And I asked Dr. J about that during class one day. I said, the Hyksos people, the sea people, were they not there during the same time when the Bible says the Jews were there? And she said, yes. And I said, is it plausible or possible at all that the Hyksos are the Jews? And she said, it's possible, but I doubt it. No further explanation. And I just thought, okay, whatever. So at this point, when we put together the historical evidence and the archaeological evidence, we come away with no other option than to recognize that the biblical narrative is at least mostly true. Any objective historian would have to recognize the biblical narrative is at least mostly true, including when it says it happened and the events that it says happened. The part that we're now at is this is the majority theory. The majority Exodus model with no miracles. So most historians now are of the opinion, yeah, most of what Exodus and Joshua says happened actually happened, with the exception of the miracles. So the history's right, but the miracles are wrong. It's an example of ancient Near Eastern literature. They integrated their stories of gods into the story of real history. And so if you read, some of you coming up in school, you might have read Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, about the Trojan horse and Achilles and Hector and all of that. When you read those stories, or Oedipus Rex, in college you might have read the story of Oedipus. When you read those stories, they integrate history and these ancient stories about gods. So in one moment you'll have Hector, who is the prince of the city of Troy, a real person in a real city, but he's being chased around the city by a god. And then he gets into a battle with Achilles. And you get back into real history all of a sudden. That's what they say was going on with the Bible, was you had real history, but they just interwove their ideas about God into the story. So they say all the history might be right, but no miracles. We, of course, would say, no, we just follow the Exodus model, which says the Exodus occurred precisely how the Bible depicts it in terms of historical era, people group, conquest, and miraculous events. That's what happened. And there's nothing in history to make us believe that didn't happen. Any of it. Okay? To give you an example of one of the people that holds that third idea, last week, or maybe it was laster week, the week before last, I had that big stack of red books. That was by Will Durant, 11-volume set, right? He was an atheist and a Nobel Prize-winning historian. So he wrote about Moses in his history. He says, Moses did indeed lead Jews to Mount Sinai. The account of the 40 years wandering in the desert, once looked upon as incredible, that is, that at one point we thought that never happened, now seems reasonable enough in a traditionally nomadic people. And the conquest of Canaan was but one more instance of a hungry nomad horde falling upon a settled community. So he recognizes all the history that happened. But then he goes on to say, when Moses led the Jews to Mount Sinai, he was merely following the route laid down by Egyptian turquoise hunting expeditions for 1,000 years before him. So there was no pillar of fire by night, no cloud by day leading them. He was just taking a route that he was aware of, having been raised in the household of Pharaoh. Pharaoh would have told him, this is where our turquoise hunters go when they're looking for turquoise in the desert. And so he followed that route knowing that there was water. That's what Will Durant says happened. So there, you can see the tension among historians, where they look at it and they go, actually, the Bible's got that pretty much right. They nailed it. But the Bible also happens to say that there were all these miracles, and of course those didn't happen because God's not real. Right? So that was a really difficult thing for me coming into a history culture of all these people who they'd admit the Bible was all right on the history, except for all the things that it also said happened. So the question of when did the Exodus occur is, I think, in my lifetime, going to be almost undeniably concluded. We just have too much evidence going for this Christian traditional direction. I really believe we're going to settle on the fact the Exodus occurred in 1446 or 47. But I still don't think that that'll make believers out of unbelievers. They'll just continue denying all of the God in it. But it did occur, and that's when. How and why? Any questions on that, by the way? I didn't really open up for questions last week. Let me just do that. I know that's a ton of information. I'm just shotgunning information at you. Okay. How and why did Moses write Exodus? Well, first of all, the how. He wrote it according to geographical arrangement. So if you read the book of Exodus, you have the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 18. They're arranging the history of the people in between Egypt and Sinai. So it starts out in Egypt, 10 plagues, then the Exodus. They're coming out, spend several chapters wandering in the wilderness. Then you get another half of the book, chapters 19 through 40, that addresses them at Sinai. Okay, this is everything that happened at the mountain. So half the story is them getting to the mountain, half the story is them at the mountain. And a lot of it is just Moses on the mountain. Because you'll remember, God specifically says, no one can be on the mountain but you. Not even sheep. Like, no animals. I'll kill the animals if they're wandering on the mountain. So it's mostly Moses talking with God on the mountain. Similar to Genesis, there's two different ways that you can look at it as how Moses wrote this. We know Moses wrote it because God told him to. Okay, he's commanded at least 3 different times, almost every 10 chapters. The Lord said to Moses, write this in a memorial and a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua. Exodus 24. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Exodus 34. And the Lord said to Moses, write these words. But he's constantly telling him, write this down, write this down, write this down. That's why he wrote it. We talked last week about the 2 theories of how physically he wrote it. Did he write it by dictation, that God literally told him every word to write down? Or did he get all these sources together and under the inspiration of God sort of edit through them and put together one cohesive book? Either one's fine. The way it reads, Exodus seems to be something that Moses probably wrote down as it was going on, and then he kind of puts it all together in the end. That would be my theory on how Exodus was written. But either way really works. What's important about the content of Exodus? The book of Exodus is monumentally important for 2 primary things. First of all, it conveys the transition of the Hebrews from being a lowly tribe to being a mighty nation called Israel. They're never really this nation before Exodus. They come into Egypt just the children of Abraham. I mean, that's really all they are. They walk in, Jacob sends them in. He says, take my bones and bring them back here whenever we get out of there. But he tells his boys, just go survive the famine and then come back. So they're just a one family unit when they walk in. By the time they walk out, you've got 600,000 plus men, plus their women, plus their children. So you have this massive group of people coming out that's a full-on nation by any standard. And so you see that transition. It's also the first book of the Bible that explains the union between miracles and natural phenomenon. How does God do miracles? How does that happen? And so you may not have even read this and noticed it, but all through when miracles are happening, Exodus starts making note of how it happened, naturally speaking. So for instance, Exodus 10:13, the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night, and when it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. So as far as the Egyptians were concerned, where did all these locusts come from? Windy. The wind has driven them out of the desert. They didn't have any reason to say God's doing this. It was the wind. And in the same way, at the end of the story, Exodus 10:19, and the Lord turned the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. So how did the locusts go away? Got windy the other direction. So from an Israelite or a Christian perspective, what caused the locust? Well, it was God. God did that. It was a miracle. But from an Egyptian perspective, what caused the locust? It was the wind. The wind did it. What took it away? The wind. Okay, so you start to see this connection between how God does things and the way that the world's going to see it naturally or materialistically. You see it also when they walk through the Red Sea. Exodus 14. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. Okay, so if you were looking at the Israelites, how did the Red Sea get parted? Moses stretched out his staff and God parted the Red Sea. If you ask the Egyptians, how did the Red Sea part? There was this crazy wind. The wind literally just moved the water to where it parted. That's the way that God has done that. And when you look at a lot of miracles through the Bible, you'll end up with this. If you read liberal commentaries, I have a commentary set that I don't use ever, except for when I want to know how liberals interpret this. Okay, so I never read it for my own benefit. It's always, I wonder how liberals read that. And it's called the Interpreter's Commentary Set. It's like 13 or something volumes. I picked it up at an estate sale for 50 cents a book. I would never pay money for this. So, but I read it, and the way that they interpret it is always the craziest theory you can possibly imagine. So when, like, Elijah makes the axe head float in the water, right? It's made of iron. How do you make an iron axe head float? They'll say, well, it actually wasn't an iron axe head. It was an axe itself, and the arm, the wooden arm of the axe is what floated. Or when they look at the 10 plagues, why did the water turn into blood? Well, it's connected with the frog thing. So this happened with the algae in the Nile River, and when the river was overcome with algae, all the frogs had to come out of the water because they couldn't get clean water. So you have the river turning into blood, that's the algae, and then the frogs come out, that's the frogs. So they just explain it away through all these naturalistic phenomenon. And we look at it and we go, yeah, that's how that Pharaoh looked at it too. He said, oh, wow, crazy wind today, bringing in all these locusts. Right? That's how that non-believers have always done it. Okay, God has used natural means to accomplish his will, rather than leaving us with no way of explaining how that happened, with the exception of a few miracles, such as the resurrection of Christ. And even with that, they still immediately said, tell everyone his disciples stole the body. Right? So we've always had a natural way of explaining away miracles. That's always the case. That'll always be the case. Major themes in the book of Exodus. There's 5 of these. I've got another slide after this one. The first one is redemption. You read the story of Exodus, you're going to see about redemption. God will redeem his people. Let me turn and read it here. From their devastated situations. You see that all through Exodus. Of course, I like the way that it starts. It's got to be around Exodus 2 or Exodus 3. And the cries of the people came into the ears of God. It says something along those lines. The cries of the Israelites came before the Lord. Something along those lines. I forget the exact wording. But he hears the prayers of his people. And he all of a sudden starts calling Moses. It's not that early on in the book, because Moses is already in the wilderness when it says that. So it's later on. But that idea that God will redeem his people, that comes out very clearly in Exodus. God had already foreshadowed that in Genesis when he told Abraham, your people will be imprisoned and enslaved, but I will bring them out when the sin of the Canaanites has been fulfilled. But here he just makes it very clear, God will redeem his people. And that echoes all through the Bible, through the imagery of the Exodus and all the way into Revelation. They shall overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. You see the redemption of God's people all the way through. Guidance, the idea that God will guide his people, that's very clear in Exodus. He gives them a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. And that summons in our minds this idea that God's hand is guiding all of his people in our times of directionlessness. When we don't know where we're going and what we're doing, God guides his people. And we may not always have a pillar of fire at night, but God just seems to always line it up. It's very interesting how God does that. He just seems to, we look at it as coincidences. Man, that lined up perfectly, didn't it? And then, you have half a second to think about it, and you go, man, that was God that did that. Worship. As again, Exodus begins to introduce this theory that God actually gets to determine how he's going to be worshipped. He tells them how to construct and how to behave in the tabernacle. He teaches them how to worship, teaches us that worship is important, teaches us the manner in which it's to be done. He regulates it. We get the idea of a Sabbath in Exodus. So Genesis 2 and 3 give us this idea of God blessing a holy day for rest, but this idea of a Sabbath really is introduced with Moses. You don't get the idea of a Sabbath anywhere before Moses. So he's introducing this concept of worship, Holiness is another theme. God forbids anyone except Moses to come up on the mountain. He forbids even animals. We see glimpses of God's exclusive holiness in that. You think about Moses' first words that he hears from God when he's approaching the burning bush. Moses, take off your shoes. The place you're standing is holy ground. Why was it holy ground? It was a desert in Egypt, right? It was holy because God was there. That's what made it holy. Okay. And last one I've got on this next page, rebellion. We get the idea that despite God's faithfulness, his people are repeatedly going to fall into rebellion. Oftentimes not even fall into rebellion, jump into rebellion. I've got a couple of examples here. They didn't have enough faith to cross the Red Sea. They complained about bitter water. They complained about the desert. They collected more manna than they were told to. They collected manna on a day when they were said they were not allowed to. They complained about a lack of water. They worshiped a golden calf. That's all just Exodus. You don't talk about Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's all before going into Canaan with Joshua. So you have just countless repeated again and again occasions of God's people rebelling. And it always brings shame. Every single time they always end up ashamed. Okay, so we're supposed to get that rebellion brings shame. We do not rebel against God, God's wishes, commands, or desires. Anything on that before we move on? Major themes. All right, last thing here. A few of the hymns that we sing or that you might have heard throughout your life that come from Exodus. Go Down Moses. I don't know if you've heard, we probably don't sing that in Antioch, but if you've ever been to a black church, this is a pretty big song. It was a Negro spiritual during the time of slavery. Reverend Lewis Lockwood, who was a chaplain of a bunch of free blacks in the Union Army during the Civil War, he heard them singing that song. He asked about it, and he found out that it had been a song that they sang from at least 1853 in Virginia. It's based on Exodus 5:1. And it's famous. It's made that phrase famous. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. You know it, right? You watched, what's the kids' movie about the Exodus? What is that? It's a Disney movie. It's like when I was a kid, they made a Disney movie about Prince of Egypt. Thank you for now that I've said it. Prince of Egypt. Like, oh, yeah. Oh, if you've not seen it, you guys have to watch. It's tremendous. It's so good. And the soundtrack is like phenomenal. But it's like back when Disney movies were amazing. So good. But yeah, that's a really good one. Oh, press so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. That's Louis Armstrong has a good rendition of that. Trust and Obey. That one we talked about last week too. Has glimpses of Genesis in it. The chorus, trust and obey, that's from Exodus 19:5. If you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. That's where the author of that hymn says that they got that idea. Trust and obey, Exodus 19:5. O come, Emmanuel, right? A big Christmas song. Did you know that song is over 1,200 years old? That's crazy that we don't talk about that. That song is like older than England. It's so old. Written at least by the 800s. One of the verses, the third verse, is entirely about the Exodus. O come, great Lord of might, who to your tribes on Sinai's height in ancient times did give the law in cloud and majesty and awe. When I was growing up, we sang a song called Who is on the Lord's Side. It's from Exodus 32:26. You remember when Moses comes down from the mountain and he sees them worshiping the golden calf, and who is it? His brother, Aaron. He's like, I don't know what happened. We just threw some gold in the fire, and out came the calf. And I mean, that could have happened maybe, but probably not. And so Moses is livid, and he breaks the rocks, and he goes up, and he's talking with God, and he's about to kill everybody. And God's like, maybe I'll kill them. And he says, don't kill them. I'll take care of that, but don't kill them all, because then people will say you weren't able to deliver your people. But Moses comes back down, and he takes his sword out, and he says, who is on the Lord's side? And a group of people come around him, and then they run through the camp, killing people at random. which is just that's a crazy story that we don't tell. There's so many like that in the Bible where it's like, well, I don't remember this story in Sunday school. Like, really cool story. But that phrase, who was on the Lord's side? We used to sing this when I was coming up. Who is on the Lord's side? Who will count the cost? Who will lay his life down, giving all to reach the lost? Who is on the Lord's side? Stand and fight the fight. Who is not ashamed to say, I belong to Jesus Christ? We had a big choir at the church that I went to as a teenager. It was like a 200-person choir. The church was 1,000 people, so our choir was enormous. And you know how you can hear it? The way that you grew up, you can hear the choir, or whoever you can hear. I hear that song, and I'm just like, oh. Takes me back, right? Back to my younger days. And then finally, we sang this song this morning, Holy, Holy, Holy. Reginald Heber. Some of you looking for names for your kids. Reginald Heber. Solid name. He wrote that song, and one of the verses, though the darkness hide thee, that comes from Exodus 20:21. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So when I've sung that song, a lot of times I've thought of it as the darkness of the world around us, the sinful darkness of our world hides you. It makes it hard for people to see you. But he was actually taking it from Exodus when God revealed himself to the people and he cloaked himself in this shroud of darkness on the mountain. And so he says, although the darkness hides you, we see you. Isn't that crazy? Different way of singing that. So there's a general overview of Exodus. The word from this morning that I am probably still going to get wrong, isagogics. I always want to say isagogic. Now I can't say it wrong. Isagogits with a T, it's isagogics with a CS. That's the word. And I don't have to say it when I'm teaching the seminary students because the lectures are recorded, so I don't have to say it anymore. But I said it right one time and got it on record. So now you know. Any questions on Exodus?